chair. MashaAllah, you look very refreshed. You just woke up. This is your first lecture for the day?
No.
What did you have? Pro and histology? Inshallah, you will enjoy this block. Did you enjoy your vacation?
Yes.
It was too short. صحيناك من النوم؟ Okay, so today we'll talk, it's a short lecture. We'll talk about the external features of the heart. Second lecture will be about the internal structures that you see and find within the heart, and there will be a third lecture on the blood supply. Most of the stuff in this lecture, not most of the, you know from the foundation block with a little bit of expansion. So, the heart is located in the mediastinum. Dr. Adil is going to give you a lecture, one full lecture on mediastinum. But simply, mediastinum is
everything the thoracic without
what is it? It is everything in the thoracic cavity minus the two lungs and the pleura. So if you open the thoracic cavity, you remove the two lungs, everything there is in the mediastinum. So our mediastinum, there is superior and inferior. Inferior has three compartments, the heart is in the middle and so on. But Dr. Atif can expand on that. It has the esophagus, it has the trachea, it has the vagus nerves and so on. So many structures, thoracic duct and so on. So the heart is located between the two lungs. So when you open the thoracic cavity, this is how they do it. They cut through the sternum, right? Like this, and then they open up with the retractor. So this is the view that you see. The heart is within the mediastinum between the two lungs, surrounded by its own pericardium. What is pericardium? What is pericardium? What is it?
It's the pericardium but for the heart.
It's the peritoneum of the heart. It is the serous membrane, right? Serous membrane, its function is to secrete serous fluid. Why do you need serous fluid? For lubrication and cushion for the heart. Too much serous fluid will strangulate the heart. Okay, so when you read about it, they say the pericardium is a double-walled sac. It's a two-layer membrane, right? But to understand the concept of the two layers and the space in between, you have to imagine this. Imagine that you have a balloon filled with water, and then you put your hand in it without rupturing it. Okay? So there will be one layer of the balloon that surrounds your hand completely, and then there is an outer layer, exactly as if you put your hand in the balloon. One layer attaches to your hand, that will be the visceral layer, and the outer layer is the parietal layer, and yet they are continuous with each other, right? Because you did not rupture the balloon. The same concept, when the heart descends into the pericardial cavity during embryonic life, it will not rupture the pericardial cavity, but then there will be this layer that surrounds the heart, which is going to become the visceral pericardium, and it is continuous with an outer layer, which is the parietal pericardium, and the space between, we call that the pericardial cavity. That pericardial cavity is filled with serous fluid, few millimeters or few milliliters of pericardial fluid. If you have too much fluid, that's going to prevent the heart from pumping. That's called the cardiac tamponade. It's an emergency. So they have to go with a needle and remove that fluid. So But the same concept applies when Dr. Atif comes and teaches you the lung and the pleura, the same concept. Visceral, parietal, they are continuous with each other. But the heart has an additional layer. Now when you open the thoracic cavity, this is the view that you will see. On the outside, we have an additional fibrous layer. This is the fibrous pericardium. Okay, it's really tough fibrous pericardium. You need scissors or you need a knife or a scalpel to cut it. When you see it in the lab, you know what I mean. Okay? So, and this pericardium fuses with the central tendon of the diaphragm, and it fuses with the roots of the blood vessels, the wall of the blood vessels entering and leaving the heart. So if I cut through this, on the outside it's going to be the fibrous, on the inside it is the parietal. So this is the heart. You know, we did open this. This is the heart. The heart is covered by this shiny layer of pericardium. We call that the visceral, right? The visceral is fairly adherent and attached to the muscular layer. You cannot peel it off. Okay? So this shiny is the visceral pericardium surrounding the heart. Clinician, they call that the epicardium. Okay? And this is on the inside is the parietal, and on the outside is the fibrous. Okay? Now between parietal and the visceral is the pericardial cavity filled with pericardial fluid. So the moment I open this, fluid is going to come out. Okay? So visceral pericardium, parietal pericardium on the inside, lining the fibrous pericardium on the outside. Now when you go to the lab, I mean, this is the same arrangement, muscle, and then visceral, then space, then parietal, then the fibrous on the outside. When you go to this is the visceral pericardium, this is the shiny, it gives the heart its shiny appearance. You cannot peel it off. This is a picture from real human heart. Now, when you go to the lab, Dr. Atif and his staff is going to talk about pericardial sinuses. We have two of them. Transverse pericardial sinus and oblique pericardial sinus. Here the concept is simple, regardless of how they describe it in the textbook, but the concept is simple. Basically the visceral pericardium, wrapping the heart, and then it reaches the blood vessels. So it's going to wrap the aorta and pulmonary trunk in one compartment, and it's going to wrap the venous side in a different compartment. Between the two, there is a space. In that space, you can insert your finger or put a probe. This is the visceral pericardium covering the heart. Then it's going to wrap the aorta and the pulmonary trunk as one compartment, and it's going to wrap the veins as a separate compartment. Between the two, we have a space. So behind the aorta and the pulmonary trunk, there is a space where you can insert a probe, or surgeons, they actually put their finger inside and they can temporarily occlude the arteries. If they want to do cardiac bypass, before they clamp, or for any reason they need to clamp that, you can insert your finger. And of course, they're going to ask you to put your finger in there when you do the lab. So the concept is easy. The pericardium, the visceral pericardium covering the heart, once it reaches the artery, the blood vessels entering and leaving the heart, it's going to wrap the aorta and pulmonary trunk in one compartment and the venous side on a different compartment, leaving a space. In that space, you can insert your finger or a probe. This is called the transverse pericardial sinus. Now, there is another sinus, which is basically the oblique pericardial sinus. What is the story of the oblique? Again, this is the visceral pericardium covering the heart, but when it reaches the area between the pulmonary veins, it's going to reflect on the outside and fuse with the parietal, creating a pocket, dead end. So here will be like a pocket, dead end, basically visceral going all the way there and then reflects on the outside. Now this pocket or dead end between the pulmonary veins in the area of the left atrium is a dead end. How do you test that? Basically, you know, you put your hand, this is your hand with the blue glove, you put it underneath the heart and keep going until, you know, your fingers will stop. It's a dead end. Why did it stop? Because, you know, there's a pocket there. Formed by what? Visceral pericardium reflects on the parietal pericardium, creating a dead end. This dead end is called the oblique pericardial sinus. So this is simply the concept of transverse and oblique pericardial sinuses, regardless of how they describe them. When it comes to arteries that will supply the pericardium, they come from the internal mammary or internal thoracic, the same name for the same artery. Basically, from subclavian, we have right and left subclavian. We have two arteries, one on the right, one on the left, descending from the subclavian, behind the sternum. And these arteries we're going to mention again when we talk about blood supply to the heart, because sometimes you need to replace the blood vessels of the heart, right? So arteries that are blocked, you cannot use them. So you need to replace them. How do you replace them? You get from the internal mammary arteries. I'll show you how in the next lecture, okay? So the internal mammary arteries will supply the pericardium, and also they receive branches from the descending aorta or the thoracic aorta. Veins, they drain into what we call the azygous and hemiazygous system of veins. Dr. Atif will explain in the mediastinum. Basically, this is the system of veins that drains the thorax and the thoracic wall. Nerves, of course, is the phrenic, mostly. Phrenic, C345 will supply the pleura, the pericardium, and the diaphragm, plus sympathetic and parasympathetic. Now, when we do a cross section, of course, again, it's going to be the fibrous, going to be parietal, and it's going to be visceral, and then the muscle is the myocardium, and then it is lined by endothelial. We're going to call that the endocardium. Dr. Zafar explained it to you, right? So you know what is myocardium, what is endocardium, and so on. Now, generally speaking, the heart has, as you know, 4 chambers, 2 atria and 2 ventricles. The atria are there for what? Receiving what?
Blood.
What kind of blood? Oxygenated or non-oxygenated? Both. So atria will be receiving venous blood. Okay? Ventricles will be ejecting blood into arteries, regardless whether oxygenated or non-oxygenated. Then we're going to say the right side of the heart deals with non-oxygenated, and the left side of the heart deals with oxygenated. Now, if you still remember, all non-oxygenated blood, regardless, even from the heart itself, will drain into the right atrium, will open into the right atrium, right?
Yes.
And from there into the right ventricle. From there into pulmonary artery or pulmonary trunk to 2 lungs. Gas exchange occurs in the lung or the lungs, and then 4 pulmonary veins, 2 from each lung, will carry oxygenated blood to the left atrium, and from there to the left ventricle, and from there to the aorta, to the rest of the body. So the right side deals with non-oxygenated blood, and the left side deals with oxygenated blood. So atria will be receiving venous blood, ventricles will be dealing with arterial blood. Right side will be dealing with non-oxygenated, left side will be dealing with oxygenated blood. Now, when you open, the heart, they say it is pyramidal in shape. When you say pyramidal, it has a base and the apex. Apex is the left ventricle, right? The base, as we're going to see later on, is basically the left atrium, as we're going to see later on. But let me do this first. Now, when you open the thoracic cavity, this is the view you're going to see. You're going to see right atrium, you're going to see right ventricle, and you're going to see left ventricle, and little extension of the left atrium. It's called the auricle. This is the auricle of the ear, little extension. So this is the auricle, left auricle of the left atrium. Left atrium is not seen. If you want to see the left atrium, you need to rotate the heart, okay? This is the left atrium with the 4 pulmonary veins. This is the view you see anteriorly, but to see the posterior view of the left atrium, you have to rotate the heart. So this is the anterior surface of the heart, or the sternocostal surface, because it is behind the sternum and the ribs. So since we have anterior, we have to have posterior. The posterior surface of the heart, you have to rotate the heart, and it is basically the left atrium. It's not only the posterior surface, but it's also the base of the heart. Remember we said its pyramidal has a base and the apex. The base of the heart is the left atrium, and the apex is the left ventricle. Okay, so basically, this is the anterior surface of the heart, the sternocostal surface. This is the base of the heart, or the posterior surface, which is basically the left atrium with the 4 pulmonary veins. And the heart is sitting on the diaphragm. We have the 2 ventricles. This part is sitting on the diaphragm. That's why we call that the diaphragmatic or the inferior surface. So the inferior surface is formed by the 2 ventricles, and it is sitting on the diaphragm. That's why we call it the diaphragmatic surface. So 3 surfaces of the heart. One is anterior or sternocostal. One is the posterior, which is the base of the heart, which is the left atrium, basically. And one sitting on the diaphragm, which is the inferior surface or the diaphragmatic surface formed by the 2 ventricles. Now, on the outside of the heart, there are a number of sulci, 3 depressions that will separate between the major structure. Number 1 is called the coronary sulcus. Coronary sulcus is the sulcus that separates the 2 atria from the 2 ventricles. Okay, and it goes around the heart. It's seen posteriorly mostly. Anteriorly, it is masked by the root of the pulmonary trunk. But posteriorly, you can see it clearly, and you can see this structure running in it. It's called the coronary sinus, which is the main venous drainage of the heart. So, coronary sulcus is a sulcus that surrounds the heart and separates between the 2 atria from the 2 ventricles. Separates the 2 atria from the 2 ventricles. It's called the coronary sulcus. Why? Because it hosts the coronary sinus, which is the main venous drainage of the heart itself. Okay, there is another sulcus, basically, separates the 2 ventricles. It's called the anterior interventricular sulcus. And then when we study the blood supply, we're going to refer to these sulci because they host the blood vessels that will supply the heart. So the anterior interventricular sulcus will host the anterior interventricular artery. We're going to discuss that later on. Since we have the anterior interventricular sulcus, we have to have a posterior interventricular sulcus. The posterior interventricular sulcus is not on the posterior surface. Posterior surface, if you still remember, is the left atrium. But it is on the diaphragmatic surface, the surface that is sitting on the diaphragm. And it's going to contain an artery. Guess what we're going to call that artery? Posterior interventricular artery. So, 3 sulci. One separates the atria from the ventricles. We're going to call that the coronary sulcus. One anterior between the ventricles, anterior interventricular, and one on the inferior surface. It's called the posterior interventricular sulcus. Okay? So with this view, you know that the right border of the heart is the right atrium, right ventricle. The inferior border is mostly right ventricle, left border is the left ventricle here, and the auricle of the left atrium. Now, from now on, you're going to be dealing a lot with the surface anatomy of the heart. What do we mean by surface anatomy? How the location of structures, deeper structure as they correspond to areas on the surface of the body, right? And there is a very important landmark.
Sternum.
Right? This is the heart is behind the sternum. 2/3 is to the left and 1/3 to the right. Right? This is the sternum. Sternum has 3 parts: manubrium, and then the body, and the xiphoid process. Right? Now, at the junction of the manubrium with the body, if you go from the suprasternal notch and go down, you will feel a ridge going horizontally. That is at the junction of the manubrium with the body. It is called the angle of Louis. Angle of Louis. That line, this ridge here at the junction of the manubrium with the body, corresponds to the second rib. So if you go laterally, you go down, you feel it, and then you go laterally, that is the second rib. Okay? And from there you start counting ribs. Rib 2, rib 3, rib 4, and so on. Now, they say the angle of Louis corresponds to the second costal cartilage. Why costal cartilage? Because, you know, the rib has a bony part and cartilaginous part attached to the sternum. Okay? So, once you identify the second rib, the rest is easy. This is the second, this is the third, the fourth, fifth, and so on. And the spaces between the ribs, we call them intercostal spaces. So this is the first intercostal space, this is the second intercostal space, this is the third intercostal space. Now remember, the heart is pyramidal in shape. It has a base and has the apex. The apex of the heart is located here at the left fifth intercostal space at the mid-clavicular line. So if you draw a line from the middle of the clavicle down, it's about 8 to 9 centimeters from the sternum. That is where you locate the apex of the heart, and you can feel actually the pulsation of the heart. If you put your hand on it, you can feel the pulsation. They will ask you to identify in the professional skills, and when you do physical examination later, they will ask you to identify the apex of the heart. So what do you say? Where it is located? The left fifth intercostal space, mid-clavicular line. What happens if you find the apex is here? It means that there is enlargement of the heart. Okay? So now to mark the borders of the heart, the upper border actually extends from the second costal cartilage on the left, 1 centimeter to the left of the sternum, to the third costal cartilage, 1 centimeter to the right of the sternum. Left border goes from the second to the apex of the heart. Right border goes from the third to the sixth costal cartilages, and inferior border joins these 2 points. So again, next lecture, when we talk about the valves, I'm going to tell you where to find the labs and where you can listen to the valves in action exactly at their best location, depending on the surface anatomy of the heart. So what is the key to identify? It's not only for the heart, by the way, even for the lungs. When Dr. Atif teaches you the lungs, you know, he's going to tell you lungs and the pleura extend to this rib, from that rib, and if there is fluid in the pleural cavity, this is where you insert a tube to drain fluid, and so on. All will depend on your knowledge of the ribs and the intercostal spaces. So it is very important that you identify the angle of Louis and know how to count the ribs and the intercostal spaces according to that. Any questions? شايفين خفيف لطيف المحاضرة. I'll see you next lecture إن شاء الله.
Solo bajo.